Good evening, everyone. I am Andre Riley, the Director of Communications for Baltimore City Public Schools, and I am so excited that you've joined us this evening to learn more about the American Rescue Plan, the federal funding that will be coming into city schools, and how you can contribute to us making some really great decisions that will impact our kids in the school district. With us tonight are the CEO of Baltimore City Public Schools, Dr. Sonia Santelises. We also have some great friends from the Education Trust, as well as district staff members. So we're going to hop right to it because we believe in valuing your time. And this meeting is being recorded, so we need you to know that as well. In the meantime, Dr. Santelises, it's good to see you. Welcome.
Good to see you too, Andre. Thanks so much for not only the introduction for tonight, but also for serving as moderator. Good evening, everyone. My name is Sonia Santelises, and I am the CEO of Baltimore City Schools. And I want to thank everyone for joining us today as we really continue planning for our 2021-22 school year and beyond. I think it's really important for everyone to know, I'm sure many of you already do know, that the federal government is providing school districts with grants and financial support that will help with academic recovery, health and safety, and innovative ways of re-engaging with students and families. In many ways, the level of one-time funding is unprecedented. And so tonight we have gathered as both district staff members, and I want to thank them for being here. But we've also invited our partners from EdTrust. I have a special place in my heart for the team at EdTrust. Not only did they allow me to work with them for 3 years, but also they have an unwavering commitment to equity in education. They have an unwavering commitment to not only monitor, but support on the ground equitable practices that positively impact students of color, first generation college goers. And so this really is important and I think significant that they are allowing us to partner together this evening. They also understand the challenges faced by our students and join that with the goals of policymakers in Washington, D.C. To get us started, I want to give an overview of how we're collaborating with you to determine the best way to use these grants. And we have just a few quick slides before I turn it over to our EdTrust colleagues. So first, as many of you or some of you may have already heard, here in Baltimore City, we really have launched into activity that we are calling our Reconnect, Restore, and Reimagine initiative. And this is City Schools' way of really actively engaging in recovery planning by focusing around some key areas that both align to our blueprint, but also really invite a cross-section of folks across the district to really dig in work groups. You'll see the categories listed here, and it really does represent members of our parent community advisory board, principals, teachers, along with central staff to really serve in these work groups. What we have said is that the first iteration of our recovery plan will be finalized in July 2021. But I also think it's important for everybody to note that even that July 2021 date is our first iteration of our commitment, is to really make sure that we are checking in frequently to monitor our progress and see how we might need to adjust. Next slide. You'll see our stakeholder engagement review. This is a little bit of an overview of really the heavy lift that our family and community engagement team, along with staff across the organization, have come along to support. So you'll see that we've been holding meetings within different city council district sessions, sessions for community partners, students, families, teachers, because we really do want to make sure that we have a recovery strategy that reflects not only the input of the community, but also feedback on the draft plan. Next slide, please. Great. What you'll see is the input links, our recovery plan to incoming federal funds. So you'll see that our May feedback, it's been a whirlwind. It was a whirlwind month of May for us. We'll be coming out within the next week or so with some of our first draft documents and work plans that really reflect the first kind of something for feedback from our community with regards to those plans. And then you'll see the ESSER amounts. We're slated to receive about $688 million in federal grants from the federal government. And so that input that we are asking from our partners will really help us determine how to use those funds. Next slide. And so without further ado, another big thank you. I'm going to turn this over to Tara Wallen from the Education Trust to really help us learn more about the American Rescue Plan Act so that we're informed, our community is informed, and we really know how to approach this from a lens of education equity. Thanks so much, Tara, again, to you and your colleagues for being here tonight.
Thank you so much, Dr. Santelises. We're excited to be here. I'm going to mention a little bit more about the Education Trust if you aren't as lucky as the superintendent is to know us well. But I also want to introduce my colleague, Kayla Patrick, who will be presenting in a little bit to talk more about unfinished learning. And so when she pops up, she will introduce herself. But for those of you that don't know, we can go and go to the next slide. There's a little background on the Education Trust. We are a nonprofit organization. We are based in Washington, D.C., but support advocates on the ground in a number of states. And we particularly focus on advocating for policies, practices, and strategies that will address opportunity gaps for students of color and students from low-income families. We do that through a wide variety of things, including research and original analysis, as well as advocacy. And so we're speaking to you today as people who are deeply focused on making sure that parents and families and students play an active role in working with their districts and their states to figure out how to use these resources from the American Rescue Plan in an equitable way to actually move us forward, not to where we were before the pandemic, but even further ahead in closing these opportunity gaps. Next slide. So how did we get here? I think it's important to know, you may have heard some of these acronyms floating around, that there have kind of been three large federal relief packages that included funding for K12 education. So last March, when the pandemic began, there was something called the CARES Act, which provided about $13 billion nationally for K12 education. Of that, city schools received around $48 million. There was another package of relief funding in December of 2020, and city schools got about $197 million from that. That second package of money, most places are still spending, they're working with their states to get that money from states to districts, and then to actually use it to think about things like physical school reopening, but also to fund summer programming and even things into next school year. Next slide. But we are primarily going to focus tonight on what's called the American Rescue Plan Act. So this was signed into law in early March. It is by far the largest rescue package of the three that I mentioned, but where those provided about $70 billion for K12 education total, this provides around $123 billion for K12 education. I think I'm going to pause here for a second.
Hi, Tara, thank you. All right, guys, I neglected to mention this before we entered the EdTrust portion of our event. But whether you're watching us on Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, wherever, we want to hear from you. And we know you're going to have questions. This is pretty high level stuff. So I want you to take some time, put your questions in the chat. We have members of the communications team that are monitoring our channels. We're going to elevate those questions as appropriate here to our presenters once they're done with their opening comments. And we'll do our best to answer your questions, but I want to make certain this is a two-way conversation, so we want to hear from you. Thanks, Tara.
No problem. We love questions, so want to definitely hear from you, and you got us just in time. We're about to dive into the meat of the American Rescue Plan Act and what it means for city schools. I'll also say you can go to edtrust.org, where you can find both some of the resources we're going to mention. You can also find Kayla, Patrick, and I on that website if you have any follow-up questions. So we'll go ahead and jump to the next slide and dive in what the American Rescue Plan includes for K12 education. So essentially, the federal government passed this about $123 billion for K12 education. And then that funding is distributed to states. So the Maryland State Department of Education is getting funding. And then the Maryland State Department of Education will also give funding to each district. And the way they decide how much money each state or each district gets is based on how much that state or district gets from Title I, which I think many of you are familiar with, the federal program particularly targeted to students from low-income backgrounds. So if you're in a state or a district with more students, so more Title I funding, you will get a larger share of the American Rescue Plan Act funds. So when the money comes into Maryland, Maryland can keep 10% at the state level. So that's funding that the Maryland State Department of Education can make decisions about how to use to support statewide efforts. But then 90% of the money will go down to individual school districts. So this is going to be a highly localized process to decide how to use that money. One thing that's a little new in this package than some of the other federal money that has come before is that the American Rescue Plan requires states and districts to set aside money to address unfinished instruction or unfinished learning. Kayla is going to talk through what some of those evidence-based strategies are that we hope districts and states are focusing on. And I should just say these are minimum amounts. So Baltimore City will need to spend at least 20% of the money that it gets to address unfinished learning and address students' social, emotional, and academic development. But we certainly expect as advocates, it's going to be significantly larger than that in terms of the money that's being spent on these students. Next slide. So what is city schools receiving? I should say this is just from the American Rescue Plan. So just from the March package, about $443 million. So I think you heard at the beginning, Dr. Santelises mentioned the $688 million. That's if you look across all three of the big bills I mentioned. So this is just focus on this latest one. And of that, at least $89 billion or so has to be spent on addressing unfinished learning. But all the rest of the other 80% could be spent on addressing unfinished learning or other strategies to close opportunity gaps and advance outcomes. Next slide. So what are the key dates and timelines to know? Well, first is that the U.S. Department of Education has already given states, so Maryland State Department of Ed, 2/3 of this final batch of money. To get the last 1/3 of money, states will need to submit an application to the U.S. Department of Education by June 7th, so in just 4 days. I will say we haven't seen Maryland's state application, but for those of you who may be engaged in state advocacy, you should certainly be asking Maryland State what it's planning to put in its application. They should be doing active outreach, we'll talk about. But then once that state application is approved by the U.S. Department of Education and the state gets money, it will distribute money down to school districts, and it's supposed to do so within 60 days. So the fastest it seems like this process could happen is that money could be coming down to districts in the late summer. And so that's why I think you heard Dr. Santelises talking about having a firm plan by the end of July. Districts are required within 90 days of getting the money to actually submit a plan to the state about how they're going to use their ESSER funding. And we'll emphasize this a couple of times, but they're required to do meaningful stakeholder engagement around what goes into that plan. And so I think this is one step in the process for Baltimore City to gather that input. Maryland State Department of Ed has not shared district application details yet. So they haven't shared a template or a firm deadline. So I think Baltimore City is working on the timeline to get something in the next few weeks. Next slide. So how can this funding be used? Well, first, we think it's really critical, and we've been working with partners in Maryland, including the Maryland Alliance for Racial Equity in Education, which I'd encourage you to look up, to make sure that states and school districts are meaningfully engaging stakeholders. And that should include students, families, civil rights organizations, superintendents, school leaders, educators, school staff, stakeholders representing underserved student groups, so English learners, students with disabilities, and other systematically disadvantaged students. And then they should be using that input to decide how to use the funding, which will extend into 2024. But there's a lot of flexibility in how these funds can be used. They can be used to address the impact of interrupted instruction. They can be used to prepare schools for physical reopening. So if you need to do any kind of sanitation, COVID testing, vaccination, if you need to do any kind of facility repair or improvements, including things to improve air quality, if you need to use it to purchase technology, if you need it to provide more mental health services and supports, including things like opening full service community schools or traditional schools, providing them the wraparound supports they need to do to have to be community schools, to hire more school counselors, to help ensure you don't lose any staff and actually have additional staff to help with some of the strategies Kayla's going to talk about, and anything else that's allowed under most federal education laws. So there is a lot of flexibility in these funds, and that's why it's so important that districts are getting input from stakeholders about what to do with them. Next slide. So I'm going to not read all of this. This is a lot of words on a slide, but the big takeaway here is that besides the elementary and secondary education relief funds that I just talked about, the American Rescue Plan provides us lots of other targeted investments that are aimed at education and children and things like nutrition. So there's additional money for students experiencing homelessness. There's additional money for students with disabilities. There is more money for broadband access, providing benefits to low-income families to subsidize internet and help pay for devices. City Schools has actually already published on their website how you can access some of those broadband and device benefits. There's more money for Head Start and childcare. So most of that funding that's listed here will go to states, so the Maryland State Department of Ed, and then they will distribute or figure out what to do with that within the state. So these are all things to keep an eye on that are beneficial to children in city schools. Next slide. So as an organization that's focused on making sure advocates, parents, families, students have what they need to ask the tough questions, we put together a document that's focused on 5 questions to ask districts. So I think, we want to share these with you, and then we hope over the next few weeks, as you all are engaging and providing feedback to city schools, these are the types of questions you're asking of their leaders, that you're asking of other district leaders, to make sure that the funding is actually going to drive better outcomes, particularly for students who have been historically marginalized. You can find this on edtrust.org, but I'm sure we can send a link out after as well. So next slide. So what are the 5 key questions to ask? If you remember nothing else from this presentation, these are the 5 things you want to take away. It's critical to ask districts how they are going to meaningfully engage a diverse and representative set of stakeholders. So in developing this plan and implementing it all the way through 2024. So this is a great first step, right? A public forum in order to provide information and answer questions. But we hope there's lots of different ways that city schools will be communicating with you all and gathering input. Some of that could be through working groups or advisory committees. We've seen districts and states that are using public surveys or focus groups or information sessions. And I think some of that has happened in city schools and some of that will keep happening. The second question to ask district leaders is, what data will they use to identify student needs, including needs that might have been unmet prior to the pandemic? And how are they going to monitor how students are progressing? So this includes data on which students have actually experienced interrupted learning, where they may need additional academic support, but it also may mean which students still don't have access to broadband or devices, which students may be in need of additional mental health or social emotional supports or physical health supports, which students have been impacted economically by the virus, and maybe they're high school students, they may be working to support their families. What is all the information you can gather about students that can help you identify the strategies that make the most sense across the district? Third, how is the district ensuring funding is targeted to the students who need it the most? So as I mentioned, the district will get money based on its share of Title I, but then City Schools has lots of decisions to make about whether funding is maintained at the district level for district-wide activities, whether some of it is distributed to individual schools for things like additional staffing or particular interventions. And we as advocates want to make sure that that money is actually going to the students who need it the most. We know there are some students, for example, students with disabilities or English learners, that require additional services, which often cost more than students who don't fit into those groups. The fourth question is, how will the district target additional resources to create safe and equitable learning environments and provide whole child supports? So this could mean the district is looking at hiring additional counselors or additional support staff. It could mean building in time during the school day for advisory groups or other relationship building opportunities for staff and students to either build a relationship or rebuild a relationship if they haven't been together in a while. And then the fifth question here is around, how's the district going to implement evidence-based strategies to address unfinished instruction? And this is where Kayla is going to jump in just a moment and give us a lot more information about what is an evidence-based strategy and what should you all as community members or families or students be looking for in City Schools' plan to know that they're choosing evidence-based strategies. Next slide. And we can actually just go ahead and jump to the next one. All right, so I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Kayla Patrick here. She can introduce herself and then she'll take us through the rest of the presentation.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Kayla Patrick, and I'm going to talk about what the research says about how we can support students and make sure that they're getting what they need so that they can be on grade level. Next slide. So you may have heard Tara mention unfinished learning many, many times. So we at EdTrust have made the conscious decision to really use the term unfinished learning. So we're looking at the many assets students bring to the classroom and into school buildings instead of thinking about the deficit. You may have heard other terms that are similar, like learning loss or learning gaps. And we think at this moment requires more asset-based language to make sure that we're really capturing what students are experiencing, which is some systematic barriers to having mastered content that they may have mastered in a typical school year. And so we really want to acknowledge that it's no fault of theirs, but a fault of the situation that we are all in. Next slide. So I may also use the term accelerate. So we have also made a conscious decision to think about how we can accelerate student learning versus remediate. And so the research says that we can really do a really good job of complementing what students are learning in their typical classrooms with the information they need to fill in those gaps that they may be experiencing due to building closures or other disruptions in their life, like internet access or family loss. We can really help them to master those skills that they haven't mastered by complementing what they would learn in a typical school year. That's very different than remediation, where we have students repeat an entire school year or sometimes more because they haven't mastered a slither or a slice of something that they would have mastered typically. And so we are also going to use the conscious decision to really accelerate learning. So adding on to what students are typically learning instead of making them repeat an entire school year. Next slide. So I'm going to talk about research, but I want to really talk about it in terms of a real student. So Maya isn't a real student. She's made up, but she is experiencing many things that real students are experiencing across the country. So Maya lives with her mom, who was a nurse, her grandmother, her 12-year-old brother, and her 3-year-old sister. So there's a nice family living in the same household. She shared a computer with her brother for the first 4 months of the pandemic. So sometimes they had to alternate logging on to class because they only had one computer in the household. Her school opted for 3 hours of Zoom class a day. So that means that she was in school significantly less time than she would have been if school buildings were actually open. Her neighborhood also suffered from unstable internet connection. So some days her and her brother couldn't even log on to class. It's important to acknowledge who Maya is as a person. So Maya is a natural caregiver. She always wants to help her mom and siblings in any way that she can. And Maya hasn't had contact with any school staff outside of her Zoom class. So she's feeling a little disconnected from school. Next slide. So Maya, like many other students, is experiencing unfinished learning, right? She hasn't had a chance to master some of those skills she may have mastered had she been in school buildings. So let's talk about what the research says schools can do to support students like Maya. One of the strategies that we've identified by digging deep into existing literature, so we spent a couple months reading all available research around what we can do to catch students up and to make sure that they're on grade level. And one of the things that pops up a lot is something we're calling targeted intensive tutoring. It is sometimes more often known as high dosage tutoring. And what that means is that a single tutor, so the same tutor, works over an extended period of time, which in most cases is all school year, every day on academic skills. And so that means that one tutor is sitting down with students every day, sometimes during the regular school day, to really help them to master that content that they may not have mastered. There are lots of key equity considerations that we need to be mindful of as Baltimore City Schools is rolling out their plan for the next couple of years. It's really important that that tutor is well trained. So that means they need to have professional development before they sit down with students. Sometimes while they're sitting down with students, they need to, or during the duration of that, they really need to get that feedback. And sometimes they need to do it to have a recap afterwards, right? So there's 3 stages of professional development that really works. It also requires that a single tutor is working with less than 4 students at a time. It's really important that we are giving students the attention that they need. And the research shows that more than 4 students is really getting into the less effective area of targeted intensive tutoring. It's important that they're working on a skill building curriculum, right? So students like Maya, who may not have mastered multiplication, for example, she needs to spend that time with her tutor, really focusing on multiplication and really mastering those skills so that she can move on to the next grade. It also needs to be targeted to the student's needs. So how do we know that Maya hasn't mastered that multiplication? We know by giving students assessments or diagnostics to really figure out where they are experiencing that unfinished learning, where they haven't mastered those skills they may have mastered in a typical school year, and where they're excelling as well, right? So we want to be able to fill the gaps, but also challenge and push them when they are ready to move on to the next stage. Next slide. So at EdTrust, we realized that many districts are going to have to deal with trade-offs for many different reasons. So what we did is we used the research to make a chart to really map out what's effective and what's not effective. And so in the best case scenario, school districts would be trying to get to the left side of this chart as much as they can, but we know that that's not always possible. So what does the research say? The research says that tutors are most effective when they're certified teachers. That's just because certified teachers are experienced and they have that experience working with students and have that professional development usually under their belt, but that doesn't mean that they don't need additional professional development. So the research shows that certified teachers are really the best at helping students to get back on grade level after disruption. That doesn't mean that paraprofessionals or trained volunteers can't also be effective tutors. We just need to make sure that those folks are really, really, really well trained. And also, as I said before, the student to tutor ratio is critically important. The research shows that the most efficient way to do this, so thinking about constraints that districts are experiencing, would be placing 2 students with 1 tutor at a time. I already mentioned the importance of a skill building curriculum. We want to make sure that students are actually learning, right? And working on those skills that they need. So it's really critical that we're doing that. And also it is important that we are thinking about when we are offering students tutoring. So the tutoring that happens during the school day when kids are already in school is most effective because we have that access to them. So sometimes school districts will schools will look at their schedule and create an extra block in the schedule to create a space and time for students to receive tutoring. And it's really critical that we're thinking about who we're tutoring, right? So the research shows that younger students are the most, they learn the most, right? So that means that tutoring is most effective on our youngest learners. But research also shows that high school students have seen some gains when getting access to tutors. They just are a little bit smaller than what our youngest learners gain. Next slide. So the next strategy I'm going to talk about is called expanded learning time. So this could be after school, summer school, or even in-school programs sometimes expand learning time. And it's really about adding some time for kids to really engage in more content and really close those unfinished learning gaps. So the key equity considerations here are very similar to the last ones we've seen for tutoring. It needs to be aligned to what kids are typically learning in the school day. So that means that if a student like Maya is really learning long division in her school day, then the work that she does after school or summer school should really complement that. So that means maybe her after school teacher is really in communication with her typical school day teacher so that they can build on what each other are working on. It's really important that those after school, summer school, or those expanded learning time educators are well trained and that they have small class sizes. Critically important here, again, I can't emphasize this enough. Additional time in school really does not work if we're not using the typical school day really, really well. So we need to be delivering high quality content and instruction to students in the typical school day. And if we're going to add on time to that, it has to be complementary to what we're doing in the school day. Next slide. So this chart is much like the chart on tutoring, and you'll see very common themes in terms of the curriculum. The professional development is really, really important. For expanded learning time, it's really most effective when it happens during the school year. It's really, really difficult to get kids back into school buildings during their personal time, right? Kids don't want to go back to school during winter breaks or summer breaks. So it's really important that we're thinking about how we can make sure that students are actually attending and the students that really need the extra support are actually getting that. There is such thing as too much school time. And there's really a sweet spot in terms of how many hours of content we add into a student's life. And so the sweet spot is between 45 and 100 hours annually. And like I said, that class size is really important. And I'm going to talk about class size and certified teachers on the next slide. So this is a cautionary tale that I need to make sure that I tell. Not too long ago, Florida passed legislation requiring double blocks of reading, right? So they identified that their students really needed additional time to master reading. And so they added an hour or so a day into their schedule so kids could have that extra time to learn reading. And a study found that in some places it really wasn't that effective. And in those places, if you open up the hood and you really look under there, you find that those places didn't have certified teachers working on that expanded learning time, and the class sizes weren't small. And so these things really, really make a huge difference. Next slide. So the final strategy I'm going to talk about is something we often forget, and it's that we really need to build strong relationships and connections with students. So students like Maya, who have been out of the classroom for quite a long time, and she hasn't had that connection with her teachers. And so we really need to start to rebuild those connections so students feel welcome in school buildings and they feel motivated to do the work and that they want to be there. Next slide. So what does that mean? It's really important that we're thinking about building developmental relationships. So if you look on this slide, you might see some themes that you might be thinking to yourself, this is just how we should treat human beings, right? We should express care and challenge growth and provide support, share power, which is really important and we often forget in the school setting, and expand possibilities. So all of these things are critically important in terms of building strong relationships with students and their teachers. And the research supports that this really does make a difference and help students to grow and actually make gains in a time like this. Next slide. So here's my final chart. In terms of building developmental relationships, the research shows that certified teachers and other school staff, so nurses, the cafeteria workers, the janitors, really are the most effective in building strong relationships with students, right? They're already in school buildings. In some cases, school students already know them. And they really are the best people to build those relationships because they're already spending time with those students. Again, the group size really does matter in terms of building relationships. When you have a small group of students, you can really start to get to know them on a personal level and identify some challenges and some areas for growth. And also what they really are interested in, and that really helps to build those strong relationships. When you create moments to spend time with students around their own personal interests, right? So if Maya is really interested in dance, her teacher understands that she's interested in dance, and she finds ways to integrate that into her skill building curriculum. That will really help Maya to build a strong relationship with that particular teacher. And we have to train our educators to really be able to do that work, right? So they have to really be able to bring some cultural competency and really those skills that really help them to build those strong relationships with students. Next slide. Now it's time for questions. So I'll pass it back to Chris.
Well, almost, Kayla, almost.
Oh, whoops.
It's okay. It's okay. Thank you, Kayla. And thank you, Tara, for sharing. But to the point of this slide, guys, we've shared a lot of great information thus far in the last 40 or so minutes, and we want to hear from you. So on Facebook and on YouTube, if you're watching this and you have questions, please feel free to submit those questions in the comment section. Those questions will then be elevated to our fine panel here, both at EdTrust and with our district staff, and we'll do our best to answer them. Again, just submit a comment. We've got folks watching from the communications team, and we love to take your questions. But in the meantime, I have one of my favorite people in the district and overall, our CFO, Chris Daugherty. Chris, how are you doing?
Good, Andre. How are you? Am I coming in loud and clear?
Yep, you're coming in loud and clear. We're going to advance the slide to bring up your section, and then we'll allow you to share some information with our audiences.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Andre. I'm very happy to be here. The content and the overview that Dr. S and Tara and Kayla gave, I certainly can't improve on that. What I can say from the finance view of things is what's been touched on, and that is, and I think it was Dr. S and Tara who used the term unprecedented. These amounts are unprecedented amounts of federal funds, and I think that's appropriate because what we're dealing with and what we're coming back from, of course, we've all heard the word unprecedented so many times to describe what COVID has done to our society and to education, and so we're daunted by some of these amounts, but more than that, we're very excited. We're very excited about the possibilities, and sticking with that word of unprecedented, we're really keen from not just the finance end, but the whole city schools end, to have an unprecedented amount of input and guidance and collaboration and dialogue, because we really have not just an opportunity of a lifetime, but really an opportunity of several lifetimes. There hasn't been anything like this before. And if you're looking at the slide I'm looking at, you see the first three. The star of this show, of course, has been the ARP ESSER fund, the $444-ish million. The first three are all the federal ones, and those sum up to the $688 million number that you've heard some of the speakers mention. And for the fullness of the record, we added the three others that come out of the state for the eye-popping $692 million. And we have about 3 years to put those funds to the best use possible. And that's what gets us to have events like this and to have many, many other events that we are encouraging folks to participate in, an unprecedented amount of collaboration to get this, to get all of these goals accomplished. And we're in the midst of that now in various ways, but one thing we want perhaps to happen is this compressed amount of time when we're trying to make the best informed decisions for all the children with this 3-year spend window, which is both not terribly long, but also thankfully not overly short either. We want to really get the right systems in and the right mechanisms in, because we will have multiple years that it won't be one big bet or even 3 big bets. It will be a series of different things, like the overview indicated about all the different types of approaches that we can do. We want to do as many of the smartest ones we can, but also it was mentioned, I think, by Kayla and Tara, this is particularly flexible funding. Some federal funding, frankly, comes and it's very narrow. You can only do certain things with certain students for a certain amount of time. And frankly, these funds are not that appropriately by design. They're quite flexible, and that's what's giving us hopefully the excitement that you're hearing in all of our voices about wanting to do this in not just a way that gets us back to the way things were before, but in a way that absolutely gets us even better than things were before, even more effective ways to implement federal programs. If you could advance it one slide, Andre.
One second, Chris. There you
Yeah,
go.
so this slide is, it's more, the words are kind of hard to read, but here's why we wanted to put it in. We have a budget process every year where we engage input from the community and from other stakeholders. One other thing we're hoping to do with this ARP and the federal funds is we want folks who are, for the first time, coming into to guide us and to discuss things with us and to say, hey, what about this? And, not this and not that. We want them to come for the ARP, but stay for the annual budget process, to stay and don't just come once and then maybe depart. But we often look for ways to get folks to come and play ongoing roles as part of our process. So because of the specific timelines in the ARP money, we'll be following those. As was said by Dr. S, we're looking to get by late summer to get the first set of plans together. But the first set of plans won't be the final set of plans. So that will be a 27, 36-month process. But we encourage anyone listening and anyone who winds up hearing this recorded to also realize that we have a very open budget process for our, what you might call our regular funds. And we want to take whatever we learn from this set of exercises with ARP, which we're very excited about, and we want to bring as many smart, effective practices as we can, both in the budget process and in how funds are best utilized. So my plea is just, as I said, come for ARP and stay for good, because we're constantly looking to engage with as many folks as possible across all the issues. I hope I didn't go over my time, Andre. I saw your face pop up, and hopefully we're accessible through all the normal ways, and we're essentially in a constant state of taking input regarding how we allocate our budget.
Chris, you did a great job. I want you to stay with me because we have a question. This one might be a little bit outside your scope, so I'm going to ask Chief Jones.
Okay.
If she can introduce herself, then come on, Mike, if she's available as well. But I'll start with you, Chris. Chris, when the district is receiving these funds, both ARP, and ESSER, how does capacity come into play, or does it come into play? Do we get to a point where we can say we don't have enough money? I mean, this is too much money for us to spend. I mean, that sounds kind of crazy. But
well, it's actually, I think it's a good question, and it gets to I used, without intending to, really, the word daunting. This amount of money in this amount of time for a system that is used to keeping track of and spending a certain amount of money. It is somewhat daunting, and in fact, the questioner, we will be adding some folks in some very meat and potatoes positions, like procurement, like grants management, like other things, expressly for that purpose. We want to make sure that we, frankly, don't drop the ball on this once in 10 lifetimes opportunity because we didn't have enough buyers in our procurement office, or we didn't have enough grant managers in another office. So it's actually a really good question. And I would say that we are not just trying to do these new additional super exciting things with the exact same number of people that we had beforehand. We're adding folks. So I see that Chief Jones can add something, but frankly, I'll sum up by saying I agree with the questioner's premise, and we're going to be adding folks specifically so that we can keep the money moving the way the educators want it to.
thanks, Chris. Well done. And Chief Jones, thanks for jumping in. I appreciate you because we just received another question right after that. But when we're talking about how's the district plan to spend this money, that's part of R3, correct?
It is, and I appreciate the question, because the question also highlighted a number of positions that we might want to consider. So when we think about needing to bring on additional staff, but I would also just add that it's not just about the people. It's also about how do we ensure that we have quality implementation, which also means that we're investing in professional development. We're also thinking about what does it actually take to implement well, whether it is a district-led initiative or something that needs to happen at the school level. And we also have to be mindful of around how do these specific efforts connect to other efforts that might already be in place at a particular school, so that at the end of the day, it truly is coordinated at the school level based on the needs of the students and the families for that particular school.
Thank you, Chief Jones. I appreciate you. Before I ask the next question, I want to check something really quick. All right, I want to pause on that question. That one's a little bit complicated, but to the person who asked the question about staff burnout, that's going to involve getting input from someone who's not here, and I don't want to shortchange your question. So what I'm going to do is I'll pledge to you that we'll post back online about this, hopefully in the next couple of hours, or definitely no later than tomorrow morning, and see if we can get you a pretty comprehensive answer on this. I'm not ducking the question, but I don't believe I have the right expert here to answer it. And I don't want to put somebody on who doesn't handle that area. I don't want to put them on the spot. That wouldn't be fair to either one of you. So with that said, I want to ask my team, do we have any more questions? It doesn't appear that we do. So we're going to wrap this puppy up all in nearly a snappy hour. I want to thank everyone who joined us on Facebook, everyone who joined us on YouTube. I want to thank our district staff members, our good friends at the Education Trust, for all coming together to talk about, again, this big influx of federal money. As Chief Daugherty mentioned, once in 10 lifetimes, you're going to get more than $680 8 million, looked like it was 692. And to get that amount of money, this is a big move for us. And we're gonna need your input. So I want to leave you with a few things that you can do to keep this conversation going and to help us do a great job for our students and our families and our staff. Our R process, Reconnect, Restore, and Reimagine is ongoing. We have a number of meetings here in June, public meetings in all the city council districts, all 14 of them. I want you to join us, and here's how you can do it. You can visit our website at www.baltimoreCitySchools.org/triple-R-2021. Again, that's baltimoreCitySchools.org/triple-R-2021. Or you can just go to our website, baltimoreCitySchools.org, and click the button that says Reconnect, Restore, Reimagine. On that webpage, when you click on it, we have a list of our June feedback sessions. They start on Monday, June the 14th, and carry on to the end of the month at about Saturday, June 26th. These are virtual meetings, so you'll be safe. Log on, give us feedback on the plan that we're working on. We have different work groups that have been working in different areas that impact our students, our staff, and our families. And we need your feedback. And that feedback also helps us to determine where to apply these resources that we're getting. It's pretty important that we hear from you. In addition, follow us on Twitter, follow us on Facebook, follow us on YouTube, follow us on Instagram. For Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, the handle is @Balt City Schools, BALT City Schools. We'll update you on upcoming meetings. We'll share some of this great feedback that we've gotten. And we want to keep you involved, keep you engaged. And as always, like Chris said, don't be a stranger. You've joined us for this meeting. We've got plenty of other meetings coming up. We have plenty of other feedback opportunities. We have different polls and different things that we'll be doing in the future. We want to hear from you. Together, we're going to make a difference for kids. We're going to use these resources appropriately, and we're going to continue to be a really good school district. So with that said, I am Andre Riley. I'm your Director of Communications here in Baltimore City Public Schools. Thank you for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you, hearing from you, and hopefully getting back into the classroom sometime this fall. You have a good day.